Episode 58, Emma vs. Joseph, the 1843 Polygamy Showdown. Welcome to the Hidden and Distorted History of the Church series, where we will be looking at the historical aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. In this series, I will try and inform those unaware of the true facts of Mormon history. Recap. Last week, we exposed Joseph Smith's desperate attempts to cover up his secret polygamy scandal using the Times and Seasons newspaper. With mounting pressure, Smith manipulated the Nauvoo City Council to reassure Governor Carlin that he'd done nothing wrong, all while secretly deeding property to Sarah Ann Whitney to shield his assets. Meanwhile, U.S. Attorney Justin Butterfield arrived in Nauvoo to investigate explosive claims made by John C. Bennett. As the law closed in, Smith remained on the run until he was finally forced to surrender. This week, we exposed Joseph once again lining his pockets, this time by increasing his own salary as mayor. We uncover the shocking marriages of 19-year-old Sarah Longstroth and her 14-year-old sister to Willard Richards, while Joseph himself takes 16-year-old Flora Woolworth. When Emma discovers a lavish gift Joseph bought for Flora, her fury erupts. Meanwhile, Smith relentlessly pursues Emily Partridge until she agrees to marry him, alongside her younger sister. And in a final act of audacity, Joseph issues his so-called revelation on plural marriage, only for Emma to defiantly reject it. Do not miss this explosive episode. Part 1. Kicking off the new year. On January 14, 1843, Joseph Smith, self-proclaimed prophet and master of power plays, gave himself yet another financial boost, raising his salary as Nauvoo's mayor to $500 per year. This wasn't just a raise, it was a blatant cash grab, documented in the Nauvoo City Council Minutes, Section 1. Smith wasn't just leading a church, he was building an empire, and he was cashing in. Critics have long pointed out the dangerous overlap between his religious and civic authority. Richard S. Van Wagoner, in his book Mormon Polygamy, A History, describes how Smith's blending of religious and political authority led to disillusionment. Joseph Smith's control of both spiritual and temporal affairs in Nauvoo gave him unchecked power, which, when challenged, was met with violent resistance, further alienating both his followers and non-Mormon neighbors. Van Wagoner, Mormon Polygamy History, p. 80. Fawn Brodie, in her critical biography No Man Knows My History, discusses how Joseph Smith's dual roles created significant issues for both his followers and the broader community. She wrote, Smith's ability to combine the roles of prophet and politician was not only a means of gaining personal power, but it was also the key to his downfall. The people of Nauvoo soon realized that in Joseph Smith's theocratic vision, the boundaries between church and state were so thoroughly blurred that political and religious power became indistinguishable. Brodie, No Man Knows My History, p. 355. Smith's unchecked power fueled tensions both inside and outside Nauvoo, as locals grew tired of watching a so-called prophet use faith to fill his coffers and secure total control. Was this divine leadership, or just another prophet profiting? History isn't fooled. On January 18, 1843, a significant event took place at Joseph Smith's home in Nauvoo. A celebration marking the dedication of the Nauvoo House, an ambitious project intended to serve as a place for visitors and a symbol of the growing influence of the Latter-day Saint community. However, this celebration was also marked by the marriage of sisters Sarah and Maria Longstroth to Willard Richards, a high-ranking member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, who was already deeply involved in practicing plural marriage. Sarah was 19, while Maria was still a minor, directly associating Richards with Smith in a disturbing pattern of marrying young women, something that should not be overlooked. These marriages, though not heavily documented, were part of a broader, often secretive network of polygamous unions orchestrated by Smith and other top LDS leaders at the time. In Jan Shipp's Mormonism, the story of a new religious tradition, she addresses the darker aspects of these practices. Joseph Smith's introduction of plural marriage, especially when it involved young women and was often conducted in secrecy, remains one of the most controversial aspects of early Mormonism. The societal norms of the time were not fully respected, and the consequences of this secrecy would echo throughout Mormon history. Shipp's Mormonism, the story of a new religious tradition, p. 168. The Longstroth sisters' marriages to Willard Richards stand as just one example of the disturbing reality of Nauvoo-era polygamy, where secrecy was standard, and the victims, especially young women, were left to face the consequences of being used in a religious and social power structure. This episode, entwined with the Nauvoo house dedication, is a dark chapter in early Mormon history, one that continues to be scrutinized by both historians and critics of early LDS practices. Part 2. Handshakes with a Hidden Twist. On February 9, 1843, Joseph Smith introduced Doctrine and Covenants 129, a bizarre method for determining whether a spirit was from God or the devil, by shaking hands. Yes, you read that right. According to Smith, a physical handshake would reveal the nature of the spirit. If the spirit could shake your hand, it was from God; if not, it was evil. This revelation, which claims to provide divine insight into the spiritual world, is nothing short of absurd. Smith's test was framed as a simple, foolproof method to distinguish between righteous angels and deceptive spirits. But let's break it down. We're supposed to determine the nature of a spirit by how solid or light its hand feels. How does a spiritual handshake even work? And if this is the only reliable way to judge a messenger, how could anyone truly know if they're encountering a divine being or an evil entity? Smith claims that heavenly beings can appear in the flesh, but somehow they're different from mortals, right? The inconsistencies and contradictions are evident, especially when you consider that this revelation is used as a way to further manipulate believers into trusting Joseph Smith's increasingly strange and self-serving doctrines. D&C 129 is a deeply troubling attempt to control spiritual experiences and maintain Smith's hold over his followers. It's a test that, on its surface, may seem harmless, but it's rooted in spiritual paranoia and blind obedience. Far from offering protection from deceit, this kind of thinking traps individuals into believing that Joseph Smith's word was the sole key to discerning good from evil. It's an early attempt to solidify his power as the ultimate spiritual authority, where faith in Smith is the only thing that matters, and everything else is left to interpretation through a handshake. On February 10, 1843, Joseph Smith deeded a parcel of church property, Lot 2, Block 146, to Eliza and Emily Partridge, two young women who were to be a part of Smith's polygamous network. This deed, seemingly a straightforward legal transaction, was part of a larger, more insidious pattern of control Smith held over his followers and their assets. This specific transaction raises serious questions about Smith's manipulation of both spiritual and temporal power. By granting property to women within his inner circle, Smith not only solidified his influence, but also intertwined financial control with religious obedience. It's an unsettling example of how property, marriage, and church leadership were dangerously interconnected in the early days of Mormonism, where personal gain often trumped spiritual integrity. On February 28, 1843, Joseph Smith approached Emily Partridge again about the principle of polygamy, this time on her 19th birthday. Emily, working in Smith's home, had already discussed the subject of plural marriage with him, but it was during this conversation that Smith revealed it to her more directly. Emily recalled, "He taught me this principle of plural marriage, but we called it celestial marriage, and he told me that this principle had been revealed to him, but it was not generally known." This admission speaks volumes about the secrecy and manipulation surrounding Smith's teachings. He described polygamy, a practice he was already deeply engaged in, as a divine revelation, yet made it clear that it was not to be made public. Celestial marriage was the euphemism Smith used to mask the controversial and disruptive practice of polygamy, attempting to frame it as a sacred and private matter, while coercively bringing women into his circle of spiritual and marital control. The fact that this conversation took place on Emily's birthday only adds a layer of discomfort and manipulation, highlighting the power imbalance Smith held over the women in his life. As Emily Partridge's account demonstrates, Smith didn't just impose his beliefs on women. He did so covertly, under the guise of a sacred principle that he claimed was divinely inspired but shrouded in secrecy. This is a chilling reminder of how religious authority was used to justify deeply controversial practices in the early days of Mormonism. In 1843, Joseph Smith secretly married Flora Woolworth, a 16-year-old who worked for the Smith family. This union, like many of Smith's marriages, was kept hidden from Emma Smith, his first wife, adding yet another layer of secrecy and deception to their troubled relationship. The marriage was especially scandalous, given Flora's age and the fact that she had been employed within the Smith household, which indicates a possible exploitation of power dynamics. Joseph had already been secretly practicing plural marriage, but this event marked another instance where he was marrying young women behind Emma's back. The situation came to a head when Emma discovered a gold watch that Joseph had given to Flora as a gift. Furious and hurt, Emma stormed over to the temple lot where she confronted Joseph in a public scene, demanding an explanation. This outburst highlighted the emotional toll and betrayal Emma felt, not only from the secrecy surrounding Joseph's plural marriages, but also the manipulation involved in his dealings with the young women he married. The incident at the temple lot reveals much about the power imbalances, manipulative tactics, and the toll that Smith's practice of plural marriage took on both his personal relationships and the lives of the young women involved. It sheds light on the darker aspects of Joseph Smith's character and the devastating impact of his actions on Emma. In the spring of 1843, Emily Partridge was invited to the home of Elizabeth Davis Dufree, a woman in the Nauvoo community, where a conversation was initiated that would drastically alter the course of her life. Emily recalled that Dufree introduced the topic of spiritual wives, a euphemism for polygamy that was circulating among Joseph Smith's inner circle at the time. As Emily later described, she introduced the subject of spiritual wives, as they called it in that day. This was a clear reference to Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage, which he often cloaked under the religious term celestial marriage, to legitimize it within the context of Latter-day Saint teachings. What makes this situation even more alarming is the pattern of manipulation that Joseph Smith exhibited, particularly when leveraging female authority figures like Dufree to further his agenda. These women, who were positioned in trusted roles within the community, would sometimes act as intermediaries, subtly coaxing young women into accepting the idea of spiritual marriage with Smith. Though I question the timeline and Emily's accounts, she herself indicated that Smith introduced the concept of plural marriage a week earlier. For myself, only one account can be correct. This episode serves as another example of how Smith, a man who wielded immense power both religiously and socially, often used his position to exploit and manipulate teenage girls into marrying him in secrecy. This system of utilizing older women to pressure young women into polygamous unions is deeply troubling and speaks to the emotional and psychological coercion that was prevalent during this period. Historians and critics continue to scrutinize these tactics, as they were indicative of the broader system of manipulation and control that Smith and his followers employed to justify and perpetuate plural marriage within the early LDS Church. Part 3. Emma Plays with Fire. In 1843, Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's older brother, played a crucial role in introducing Emma Smith to the more formal aspects of polygamy, as outlined in Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. The language of D&C 132 is both disturbing and coercive, threatening Emma with eternal destruction if she did not accept polygamy as a doctrine of the Church. Joseph's attempt to force Emma into submission through this revelation exemplifies the manipulation, pressure, and emotional distress that marked the dynamics of early Mormon polygamy. Doctrine and Covenants 132 not only commanded the practice of plural marriage, but also explicitly warned of severe consequences for those who rejected it. The wording is chilling. But if she, Emma, will not abide this commandment, then shall my servant Joseph do all things that he listed. Furthermore, the text laid out eternal punishments for those who resisted the divine principle, threatening destruction or eternal damnation for those who defied it. In essence, Hiram Smith's role in presenting this revelation to Emma was part of a larger effort to sway her opinion under the guise of divine will, making it clear that her refusal to accept polygamy could lead to catastrophic consequences for both her and her family. The coercive nature of the message is undeniable. Emma was faced with the deeply personal choice of accepting a practice that went against her convictions and deeply threatened her marriage, or facing condemnation, not only from her husband and church, but from the heavenly powers themselves. As a wife who had been forced into the shadows of secrecy for much of Joseph's polygamous activities, Emma's resistance to the practice is often seen as a final stand against a doctrine that threatened the very foundation of her relationship with Joseph. At the time, Joseph's public stance on polygamy was already one of secrecy, and Emma had long been aware of her husband's multiple marriages. Still, Joseph's explicit presentation of D&C 132 and its threats made it clear that the practice would not be dismissed or kept hidden anymore, and it had the full force of divine command behind it. Emma's resistance, however, is often portrayed as an expression of loyalty to her marriage, her own moral compass, and her desire to hold her family together. In the aftermath of the presentation of D&C 132, Emma's reaction was one of anger and despair. After Joseph had introduced the revelation and its coercive threats, Emma reportedly took the original manuscript and burned it, a desperate act of defiance against the document's message. However, the contents of the original revelation did not vanish with its destruction. William Clayton, Joseph's personal scribe, had kept a careful journal and copied down the revelation shortly after its receipt. Furthermore, the Kingsbury copy, which was created by someone who had access to the original documents, was another key source that preserved the text of D&C 132. The Whitney family also had a copy, ensuring that the doctrine of plural marriage was retained, even after Emma's act of destruction. These surviving copies confirmed the core teachings of the revelation, which were later included in the Doctrine and Covenants, despite Emma's attempt to suppress them. Joseph and Hyrum Smith's tactics, using threats cloaked in the language of divine revelation, demonstrate the lengths to which they were willing to go to normalize and institutionalize polygamy, regardless of the emotional toll it took on the women involved. Ultimately, the language in D&C 132 and Hyrum Smith's role in presenting it to Emma solidify the coercive and authoritarian nature of early Mormonism's stance on plural marriage, offering a glimpse into the darker side of religious manipulation and the severe consequences of dissent. The preservation of the revelation, despite Emma's efforts to destroy the original manuscript, highlights the persistence of the doctrine of plural marriage in the early church, and the lengths to which its leaders would go to ensure it was retained and institutionalized. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.